Hey, welcome back to the Cyber Diner podcast presented by Cal Poly California Cybersecurity Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Vanucci, and this is now our 4th episode. So glad to have you here, and thanks again for keeping up with the podcast. If you want to make sure you get notified when we release new content, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or Podbean. And yes, we are broadcasting a video version of this podcast on YouTube. So head over to the CCI YouTube channel if you want to peek into the Cyber Diner itself. As always, the goal of the podcast is to connect cybersecurity learners directly to the most pertinent conversations in tech by virtually hanging out with the pros right here in the diner. So, I hope that you're ready for another serving of expertise. This week, we're chatting with Dr. Ulf Lindqvist, Senior Technical Director at SRI International. SRI is a major independent research institute where Ulf heads research and development projects and works closely with the Department of Homeland Security. He's had a specific focus on critical infrastructure for the better part of his career, and more recently, he's done work addressing the new and growing Internet of Things. Now, aside from space, these are arguably some of the biggest topics in cybersecurity in the next decade. You've already seen some major cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in the news this year, and you can imagine the impact that the security of these systems will have as we continue to make these systems smarter by adding more data sensors to their networks. This is the Internet of Things, or IoT, and it's the future of the Internet. It presents an incredibly tough problem set, but I can't think of anyone better to teach us about these things today than Ulf himself. All right, you know what that means. Thanks again for stopping by the diner, and enjoy the interview. Ulf, thanks so much for joining us today. Glad you could make it to the podcast. I'd like to start out if you would just give a little backstory about your career and SRI International.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. I'm happy to be here. My name is Ulf Lindqvist. I work at SRI International. It's an independent nonprofit research center. It was founded as Stanford Research Institute 75 years ago, but we're independent from Stanford since the 70s, and it's just called SRI International, or SRI. And we do advanced research and development across the board. I'm in the computer science laboratory, and I focus on cybersecurity.
Within cybersecurity, you have kind of a host of different things that you focus on, right? One of them is critical infrastructure, and the other one's IoT, right? Does that span the set, or are there a few more focuses you have?
Well, yeah. So my group specializes in security for critical infrastructures, where critical infrastructures are all these things that we depend on in society for our everyday life and our well-being. Things like electric power, oil and natural gas, financial systems, water and wastewater, all those kinds of things that we take for granted and we all depend on, and we don't really miss until they're not there. But we've also done research on, as you mentioned, IoT, the Internet of Things, this idea that you have all these connected devices that used to be everyday devices, like everything from cars to door locks, to coffee makers and fridges and washing machines and cameras, but they're now all equipped with computing power and networking. And since they really are computers or contain a lot of computers, they also can have cybersecurity issues, and they do, and that's what we're looking into.
Right, and so today, our main focus is going to be on critical infrastructure, but also the Internet of Things more broadly. And what I understand is you teach a course at Cal Poly where you go into some cybersecurity basics and stuff like that. And I'm thinking a good place to start today would actually be if you were teaching that class, how would you introduce the Internet of Things in a simple way?
Yeah, so that's right. I'm teaching a class called Practical Computer Security for Everyone, and it's for all majors, and it's really to give sort of the basic knowledge for people to be good citizens in the digital world and be able to secure both their own systems and information, and also when they work at companies in their career to have a basic understanding of computer security. And we talk about the Internet of Things in the class, and I explain how the same things that apply to computers will apply to your refrigerator or your door lock or whatever that device may be that now contains a computer and does networking. And of course, it's easy to show all the things with IoT that are bad from a security point of view. These devices tend to be cheap. They have low resources. They don't run the kind of operating systems that your laptop or your phone does. They're not frequently updated, etc. And what we do for IT systems doesn't necessarily apply directly to IoT systems in terms of security products to secure them, frequent updates, all those kinds of things. But I also want to show a vision for if we actually make these devices more secure, more trustworthy, there's so many things that they can enable in terms of productivity and increased well-being. A lot of IoT applications are in health monitoring, for example. And if you can trust these devices to actually protect your private information and to you can trust them with your most critical tasks, then you get a lot of benefit out of it. But if you can't do that, if they're not trustworthy because of security issues, then you can't reap all these benefits from IoT.
Well, in 2017, you had you introduced this paper, right? You and your team at SRI. It was called "The Future of the Internet of Things," and it kind of set the tone for, I think, a lot of conversations to come in the field of IoT and security. And so, you laid it out, right? You have all these different security challenges in IoT. What in a short way? Can you summarize kind of the main ones that we see that are different from security problems that we have in traditional infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that paper was focused on the risks. It was part of the ACM Inside Risks column. So it was all about describing the additional risks and create some awareness around that. So one thing with IoT devices is that they interact with the physical world in some way. A lot of them are sensors in that they sense things like the presence of people, temperature. When they're used in industrial settings, they can measure pressure, flow of gas, structural tension, all those kinds of things, which is great that we can collect all this data. And some of the devices are not just sensors, but they're actually actuators that they do something, whether it's turning on or off lights or switching railroad tracks, or it could be a therapeutic medical device that's, for example, an implanted insulin pump or a pacemaker or something like that. So they actually have a real effect on the physical world. So that's one big change, and that's again both the benefit of IoT devices and also a risk because of the potential consequences. As I often say, it's one thing if you lose your email or your the data that you've collected, that's bad, but usually no one gets hurt or dies as a consequence. But when you have devices, whether it's industrial control systems, industrial IoT, or some other IoT devices that actually interact with the physical world, the consequences of a cyber attack could be something that has a physical consequence where people actually do get hurt or even die. So that's one big change, and that's sort of really the main motivator for why myself and my research group focus on these kinds of things. Other differences is what I mentioned briefly earlier, that the things that we take for granted when it comes to IT systems and the things we do to protect regular IT systems, and that includes actually things like smartphones, because a smartphone is more like a general purpose computer than an IoT device. Those kinds of things don't necessarily apply to IoT. And then we got other problems related to management of IoT devices. The whole idea is that there's lots of them. We have some statistics and predictions showing a rapid growth of billions of connected IoT devices, more devices than we've ever seen connected to a network before. The whole idea is that they're small and cheap and you can get plenty of them and easily deploy them, but then who manages these devices? We being both individuals and organizations have a hard time sometimes keeping track of all our regular connected devices and where they are. And every company has stories about laptops or mobile devices getting lost. What about all these IoT devices that are out there and maybe vulnerable, even though you're not aware that you have them or how they're vulnerable? So there's lots of challenges with IoT, and in our research, we've been looking into addressing some of these challenges, especially as it relates to management of IoT systems.
The problem I see emerging when we talk about all these IoT devices, whether it be, especially the consumer ones, because we've talked about the difference between consumer IoT and more critical infrastructure level. But if we just focus on consumer ones, there's all these kind of weird trade-offs that I think are a little bit unprecedented, in the sense that now people have to decide if they want a convenient way to turn off the lights, but it means maybe, exposing themselves and making their home network a little bit less secure. Or businesses might run into the same thing, where you're trading these like kind of strange inconveniences for security. And I'm just wondering, like, who's responsible? Like, who else? I mean, I know SRI has really stepped up and tried to develop a practical solution for this, but at a system level, like, who's working on this problem? Whose responsibility is it to solve, kind of to bolster security of IoT devices in the coming networks?
Yeah, that's a great question that I'm not sure I have a clear answer to. I mean, it's a shared responsibility between, the person or organization that purchases the device and deploys it. They clearly have some responsibility, but it's also very difficult sometimes for them to know, what's the level of security for this device that I'm buying. And that's something that we've addressed. We've looked into methods for measuring security. There are various efforts there. And I know, for example, that NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they have an upcoming workshop on how to provide consumer labeling for IoT devices. And there are some countries, I believe Singapore, for example, has already mandated labeling of these devices. But then the question is, what goes onto a label? That's something that can enable consumers to make informed decisions. In the scenario, you're looking for something to add to your network at home, maybe something to control all your lights. You go to the big box store. How can you determine if one of these IoT hub solutions with switches and whatnot, if it's more secure than the other? And right now, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for a consumer to tell, how secure is this device? How was it developed? What will happen to my network when I plug it in? Will I be, worse off or better off, or no change? It's really hard for a consumer to figure that out. So we've looked into methods for measuring that, and also for organizations to do an inventory of what kind of devices they really have on their networks. Because, amazingly, for regular IT networks, it's actually difficult for large organizations in particular, to manage all their assets. And they may have locations, around the world. And, there are various products to help with asset management. But when it comes to IoT, that's just, a whole other category of devices that may not be managed. But they're still out there. They're still on the network. They can still, they can be attacked. We've seen all kinds of attacks on IoT devices, including botnets, where someone takes over many of these cheap devices and then use them to launch what's called a denial of service attack, where all the devices send their traffic to one given web server, for example, completely overwhelming that web server and taking it offline.
Yeah, so can you roughly describe like the scale of increase? Because you're talking about how we're adding a bunch of these little, like, maybe they're tiny little computers, but they can be used for applications like denial of service attacks. Could you describe the scale at which IoT devices are scaling, the overall, like, just sheer number of computers out there?
Right. Yeah. So I don't have a statistics slide handy, but I present that in the class, and I've shown that in some other talks. But basically, we're seeing more or less, very little growth or no growth in the number of non-IoT devices. It's not like people are, a lot of people who didn't have a general purpose computer or smartphone are getting it. That has sort of plateaued out a little bit. I mean, people are, of course, upgrading and replacing their devices, but they're not getting more of them. Whereas IoT devices, we see a growth that's, in the order of 10% per year or more. And we're already talking about billions of connected devices. So, the number of devices per person on the planet is going to be pretty large, of course, concentrated in the more industrialized world, but still. And my point there is that, this is many more devices than we've ever had connected to the internet, to a network. And we're just not used to handling that kind of scale. And then you can look at it at, complex human installations, like a smart city, for example, that may have sensors on street lights, for garbage cans, public transportation, all those kinds of things. Or, a place like a large airport that may have sensors to look at vehicles and luggage and passengers coming through and all those kinds of things. And it's just becomes a very complex environment when you throw in thousands or hundreds of thousands of IoT sensors in there.
Well, so let's take a look at something you've started to mention a little bit already, which is in 2020, you and another team at SRI proposed. Well, I guess you wrote a paper that describes the new sort of system you've developed called IoT Hound, and this is at least I understand it as a very practical. Beginning to I think a probably long list of solutions for IoT security. Can you talk a little bit about like what problem IoT Hound helps solve, and kind of where that fits in the greater story of IoT security?
Sure. So it was as part of the problem I described of managing IoT devices securely, and for those who manage systems to be able to make well-informed security decisions. So very specifically, as research papers tend to be, that looked at one particular method to fingerprint and characterize devices on a network. If you just look at the network traffic, can you determine using these particular methods that our team investigated, can you determine what kind of devices these are, and what's the certainty by which you can characterize a device, telling that this is an Amazon Echo device versus a Google Home device, for example, versus this type of camera, and with what certainty, just by looking at the way it communicates, not actually finding the device and physically looking at what it is, but just looking at the network traffic and how much network traffic do you need to actually make that determination. So that's part of developing methods for. If you look at the scenario, for example, let's say you're responsible for all IoT, all network computers at a large airport, right? So how do you, as that chief security officer, how do you know exactly what's on there? What are devices that employees and passengers bring with them versus what's actually been deployed by the many subcontractors you have working there and so forth. So this could be a way to, by just monitoring the network, listening to the wireless traffic, determine what kind of devices are on there. So and then with every so often we see these bulletins, announcements about some device or some version of a software being vulnerable. The big problem for many organizations, both in IT and in IoT, is to answer, okay, how many devices do we have that are vulnerable to this particular vulnerability? Where are they? How can we fix them? And you'd think those questions might be easy to answer, but they're not. Am I running? Do I have this particular type of temperature sensor running? Version 1.2.3 of this particular operating system? How do I know? How do I find out? And once I find out how many I have, where they are, how do I get them fixed? How do I get them updated? These are challenging problems.
Well, I'm sure they're complicated further by the fact that at least, especially just because IoT is pretty young, as far as like the complexity of the devices and their maturity. There's not a whole lot going on. I just want to like kind of focus on this idea that security is there's probably going to be a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of scenarios where you might want to know exactly what you just said, like. We found a vulnerability on this device because there's going to be, there's not a whole lot of market incentive right now for security, like there always isn't that much. But how do you approach that issue? Because it seems to be like it's also in step with how do we make companies prioritize security in IoT, so that
Right.
you can have both forces going at once.
Yeah, so that sort of comes back to your earlier question about responsibility, where I started talking about the responsibility of system owners, but there's certainly responsibility with government, and we've seen some legislation, some regulation about IoT devices, and it's probably inevitable that there will have to be something. People tend to not like regulation, but that's what got us seatbelts, airbags, backup cameras in cars, that kind of thing. They don't necessarily come because of regular market incentives. There has to be some regulatory pressure to provide certain minimum safety and security provisions. So there may have to be some of that. Our job as researchers is to develop methods that are, that make security easier to use, that makes it more effective, and that makes it economically feasible to build in security. A problem traditionally with many security mechanisms is that they're very costly, that it involves a lot of labor-intensive processes to do review, to do proper design, that kind of thing. But there are a lot of technologies and technological solutions that could be applied if they're applied right. And part of our job is to make sure that they can become usable and practically deployable. In terms of incentivizing security for IoT, we would like to get people in general to understand that if they introduce insecure devices on their networks, that increases the attack surface and the risk that they will suffer an attack. And people also need to understand that it's impossible to build something 100% perfectly secure from the start. There are methods where you can prove properties about some limited aspects of a system, but we've seen in all kinds of systems how vulnerabilities have remained undiscovered for many years, and then at some point they're discovered, hopefully by the good guys and not by the bad guys who will exploit them without telling anyone. And then there are updates necessary, and that's why you see all these things. Critical security update for your operating system or for your phone or whatever that may be. It is because vulnerabilities get discovered, and they always will be, and you always will have to make updates. You have to count on that. So when you design a system, when you deploy it, when you put it in place, you have to have methods for updating it and doing so in a robust fashion that doesn't break anything else. Because this is a great concern, especially in industrial control systems that has some overlap with IoT and what we call industrial IoT. These are the systems that control things like manufacturing, power plants, oil refineries, that kind of thing, where the operators are reluctant to just update a system because they don't know if this update is going to break some functionality and cause big problems with the physical processes that they're running. So it's important that updates are well tested, and this is the trade-off: getting an update out there quickly to fix the security problem before someone can exploit it, versus making sure that it doesn't break anything else.
Right. Well, I think these kind of security moves that we're seeing kind of at the government level more recently have come in response to some of those more critical systems becoming vulnerable or hacked. I guess the Colonial Pipeline itself wasn't directly related to IoT. At least that's my understanding. But it is a good example of what happens when big systems that are very, very important to like the backbone of society get compromised in any shape or form. And I think was it that specific issue that you had commented on? You had a quote in the New York Times, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that incident, I don't have any sort of inside knowledge of that particular incident. I can just comment generally, but it illustrates several things. One is the great threat of ransomware that has become so prevalent in the last few years, which of course, is because there's a way there for criminals to make money, and it comes together with a lot of systems being vulnerable, attackers getting more automated tools available to them, and also the rise of cryptocurrencies that makes it possible for the attackers to get paid their ransom without necessarily being directly traced, or at least they're they believe they can't be traced. We've seen some examples where government law enforcement has been able to go after the attackers and take back the money. But in traditional kidnapping, the problem has always been the handoff of the money, right? Everyone who's seen a movie knows this problem, because the whole idea is that the kidnappers get the money, and afterwards you can't easily find them. So that's where cryptocurrencies, which some people see as revolution in payment systems and freedom from national currencies and that kind of thing, has actually in a way enabled this complete plague of ransomware. And then particularly in this Colonial Pipeline case, we saw the interdependency between systems. It appears from what we know publicly that the actual control systems of the pipeline were not directly affected by the ransomware, but business systems for billing and inventory and other things were affected, and that caused the company to not be able to run their pipeline. So that illustrates this interconnection and interdependency in infrastructure systems, where it's not just one isolated system that runs the pipeline just fine. It's a mesh of interdependent systems where a company may not even be completely aware of what outside services they depend on until those services go down and they realize that they can no longer run their business as they're used to. And with businesses for good economical reasons are moving to a lot of outsourcing and cloud services, that could, in some sense, it could decrease vulnerability, because a cloud service may be a lot more available and reliable than a small company trying to run their own IT service. But it could also be the opposite, where if that particular service that you depend on, if it goes down because of some random failure or because of a cyber attack, that might stop you from doing your business.
Yeah, well, I think these different problems exist across the board in IoT, pretty much everywhere, right? Because business is being everything's moving to the cloud, everything's moving to more and more devices, and whether that be in critical infrastructure or also maybe in say a university context.
Yes,
because I know you have a connection to university, and also hopefully a lot of our listeners are also students as well. What kind of problems might we encounter in a university setting? I don't know, just like a hypothetical problem relating to IoT security. Could you think of one?
Well, I think students, young people tend to be early adopters of technology. Of course, everyone has a smartphone, although that's not an IoT device necessarily per se. It's a mobile general purpose computer with a lot of sensors on it. Just yesterday in our class, I gave a lecture on mobile device security, and to just briefly summarize this, a phone has all these interfaces that you may or may not think of. GPS for navigation, near field communication for those tap and pay applications, Wi-Fi, of course, cellular networking, Bluetooth, all those kinds of things that constitute attack surfaces for the phone. And we already know the issues of a phone collecting a lot more data than perhaps it should, with applications getting access to a lot more data than you may realize, collecting location data, where you are, all those kinds of things. So there's the phone thing, but then students may be using things like smart door locks, for example, cameras, all kinds of IoT type devices, these sort of Google Home, Siri, Amazon Echo type devices, which are cool because you just tell them to play music or turn down the lights and it will do that. But generally you need to be aware of what it is you're bringing to your home and what it is you're connecting to the network. And of course, in the past year, a lot of classes, including the one I teach, have been virtual. So it's all dependent on the network services to even do the class, to attend the lectures and labs and do assignments and all that kind of thing. So students today, compared to when I was in school, 25 plus years ago, it's a very, very different experience. And when I started in this in grad school, security was something new and kind of odd. There were just a few people who were interested in it. It was, a couple of small conferences. There wasn't really much interest or need. It was perceived as for security, and even, trying to get the university to install a firewall was something that was like, oh, that's unheard of. That will just prevent our academic freedom, etc. But then now, of course, it's unthinkable that an organization is connected to the internet without having some sort of firewall, because otherwise they would be, attacked and knocked out within an hour. So, that's been a big change, and it's always a trade-off in the academic environment, because you want all this openness, you want information sharing, you want it to be easy to connect, and you don't want things to be so restricted that it somehow makes it difficult to do education and research and all that. But on the other hand, of course, you need to have security, because there's been many attacks over the past decade against academic institutions, where they do phishing attacks against students and other employees, where they various attackers are trying to steal intellectual property from research projects, that kind of thing, and they know that academic environments are soft targets in a way, because of all the students and this spirit of open sharing. So as part of our class, we do have the chief security officer from Cal Poly and his team come and give a guest lecture and talk to the students about the realities of protecting the network of the university where they all are students, and that's a good eye opener for the challenges and the threats even to an academic environment.
Yeah, well, I think of even like it made me think of like how, especially in the computer science, software engineering departments, I remember there was just everybody's little project had to do with something like a little Raspberry Pi or a little Arduino, which is, essentially you're connecting another device to the network, and they're simple devices, so their security is a little easier on those, but they represent another endpoint. And the other thing I think of is that, college students tend to be pretty curious. I mean, we had in the place that I lived, I had a roommate who connected Amazon Echo. He used that to send requests to a Raspberry Pi that he connected to a switcher that would turn on different light fixtures in our house by turning power on and off. And so we actually had that get hacked once because it was just a very simple web server, but it didn't have very good security on it. There's a lot of different applications, both, I guess, within the academic institution and adjacent to it, in that sense. So to keep the focus on the students as we wrap up here, if students wanted to pursue more knowledge about IoT, maybe they're cybersecurity, they have a cybersecurity interest, and they're in a computer science program, software engineering program, or just a tech trade program of any kind. What can they do to find out more information about IoT? What else can they read?
Well, first of all, let's plug the class, the practical computer security for everyone. It's an introductory class on computer security for all majors. We've had students from theater, animal sciences, literature, journalism, history, all majors really, and they've students from all majors have gotten good grades in the class. It's certainly not too difficult for them. So that's that's a good way to learn more about this particular topic. There's there's some articles and books out there for those who want to study on their own. I don't have any sort of immediate direct pointers here, but we have some resources to point to in our articles. Let's see. I want to take the chance to mention a little bit about what we do at SRI and how it works. We are not an academic institution. We don't provide education, but we do academic type research, world-leading research into really difficult problems. We work a lot for the various research funding agencies of the U.S. government, because they are the ones in the U.S. who invest a lot in forward-looking R&D. But we also do some work for commercial companies and other organizations. And while we develop new theoretic world-leading research, we also want to make sure that research has a real impact in the real world. So we make sure to build tools that implement this research and actually makes it usable. And there are several examples over the years of things that actually touches people in their everyday lives, and they probably have no idea that the technology originally came from SRI. This includes things like the internet itself. SRI was one of the first 4 nodes on the ARPANET that became the internet. The very first message sent on the internet in 1969 went from UCLA to SRI. And more modern things like robotic surgery. Every modern hospital has one or several surgical robots that are used for minimally invasive surgery. And that's technology that came out of SRI. The leading company there, Intuitive Surgical, is an SRI spin-out company. And even more recently, Siri, the virtual assistant on all Apple devices, that came out of a large research project that SRI was leading. SRI spun out a company called Siri, and then one day Steve Jobs called, and Apple acquired that company and then integrated the technology into all their devices. And that was an early example of natural language understanding and interaction between humans and a virtual assistant. So those are just examples of SRI technology that was really breaking new ground and then implemented into something useful and has impacted the lives of millions of people.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all that, Ulf. Congratulations on all of that amazing research, especially what you're working on now. I'm really excited to keep up with your work and hopefully find out that down the road you're doing even more to help secure the IoT and critical infrastructure and everything like that.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you, Ryan. It's been great to get this opportunity to talk about some of the research areas that I feel strongly about and that we're hoping, as you said, to make some progress.
Thank you. Thanks for stopping by the Downer, Ulf. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
All right. So how about the IoT? What a conundrum we have on our hands with the IoT, especially as more of these devices are added to systems that we consider critical infrastructure. Building a smart world out of smart devices might seem intimidating from a security perspective. But like Ulf said, I think it's important that we continue to think about what these systems can look like. What if we can build networks that can be trustworthy enough to handle our critical systems and our most sensitive information? R&D teams like Ulf's are at the helm, making sure that we have those solutions in place as networks continue to grow. So, if you enjoyed our conversation today, make sure to check out the show notes for the episode at cci.calpoly.edu/cyberdiner/episode 4. We'll have a few resources linked as well as a summary of what we talked about, so you can reference that later if it suits your fancy. The Cyber Diner podcast. Please take a minute to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts to stay up to date on our episode releases, which will be about every 2 weeks or so, give or take. Have a great rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to seeing you back here next time on the Cyber Diner podcast. This podcast is presented by Cal Poly California Cybersecurity Institute, where we're training the next generation of cyber experts to navigate today's complex threat landscape. To learn more about training and research programs, visit cci.calpoly.edu. Special thanks to the team of Cal Poly staff and students that helped put this podcast together, including CCI Program Manager Martin Minnick and Cal Poly students and alumni, including Grace Pickering, Lauren Boyer, Nathan Danielson, and Jared Contreras. A special thanks to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for support in the planning and production of this episode. This episode is made possible in part by the Department of Defense and California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. The content of this podcast reflects the views of the California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo California Cybersecurity Institute, and does not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Defense, Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, or the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research.